Okay, so I think the majority of people listening do know what eelgrass is, probably are quite familiar with it. I can't see everybody's uh, ch- uh, if you put your hand up, probably most of you would say you're familiar with eelgrass. So what I'm going to start off with is just a short introduction about the habitat. Because most of you, if not all of you, are educators and interested in the marine world. Um, I'm calling this presentation Eelgrass's Teacher because my dear friend Gloria um, motivated me to write an article for Educators Journal. And we titled it Eelgrass's Teacher. And Kathy did the same with another subject. And it was wonderful because we never really articulated what we had been doing for a very long time. And to write it down into kind of a semi-academic journal was a chore. You know, when you're doing so much, you'd never sit down and actually articulate what you've been doing. But Kathy and I, especially Kathy Karasfeld, with Yogi's support, had been doing many environmental education programs on the beaches of Victoria for many years. And it was kind of the inspiration to use eelgrass as the medium to describe some of those field experiences. I come from that background of experiential outdoor education, and I treasure it, and I honor anybody who does it because I think it is the most powerful way to bring across to children how getting wet and dirty and mucky is the best thing to learn about not only nature, but our connectivity to it and to ourselves. So the whole story about eelgrass started with this woman, Trish Farrell, who was part of the First Nations up south, north of Parksville. And she remembers as a child, the age of 10, the herring coming in the spring to lay their eggs or their roe on the near shore. And she said they were so thick that it looked like broken glass on the surface of the water, that the herring were just so thick. And they would lay their eggs on boughs, and I'm not sure if they were cedar boughs or other kinds of trees, but I'm pretty sure they were cedar. So the nation would place the boughs on the surface of the water. As the herring came in, they would lay their roe on these boughs, and then they were collected into bins. Now, Trish is standing on the shore of a beach on Thetis Island. And at that point, we had been talking to groups of high school students for about 5 or 6 years. They were part of a program called LIFE, a leadership initiative for Earth. And it was a wonderful program. We started way back when, the early 90s, with maybe a half hour, and we stretched it every year until we had a full day program. And when Trish was speaking about the herring and the eggs being laid on the boughs, she was speaking from experience, being the age about 10, where she loved the roe so much, it tasted like candy to her, that she would sneak behind grandmother's back and swipe these boughs that were in the bins behind grandmother's back because it tasted like candy for her. So she was, trying to sneak some real treat. And grandmother, without turning her head, said, "And what are you doing?" And Trish, of course, was embarrassed, but her mouth was full of roe. So she kind of mumbles, "Nothing, Grandma." And again, grandmother does not turn her head, but says gently, "Is it good?" And Trish says, "Yeah, it's really good." So that experience of speaking to high school students, you could hear a fir leaf fall in the forest. They were so enchanted with her story. And as I'm hearing it, we had small groups of high school students arriving from these boats that came to the island. Um, and so I'm hearing it over and over for the first day of our program. And I'm thinking to myself, we're always taking, we're always taking fish. We're always taking something from the ocean. And Trish is describing something that's circular, that they're not killing the herring, that they're harvesting the roe, and that the roe is nourishing their community. And even as a collector of specimens, bringing them to shore to teach children about marine critters in tide tanks or collection tanks, I always felt like I'm part of that taking mentality. And so about the third time she's telling the story, I finally realized eelgrass is a great medium to talk to people about the treasures of the ocean. At that point, this was about 95, 96. At this point, there wasn't much connection in people's minds about freshwater systems flowing into estuaries and bays. Anything that happened out there was anybody's guess. So when we thought about eelgrass as a medium to translate marine waters to people who lived on shore, especially near saltwater environments, to translate the ocean into something that they could relate to, because we would call it undersea gardens. And through that translation and that metaphor, we were able to slowly raise awareness about the importance of estuaries and bays and quiet areas where eelgrass grows in shallow waters, to make a relationship with something that was quite mysterious to many people, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So as this metaphor developed in my mind, I started approaching the province and the federal government about getting some support to actually restore eelgrass. And one of my heroes in the environmental movement was Doug Bifford, who's now passed on. He worked for BC Parks. And I talked to him about this idea, and he said, go look at Sneakwith, that point, Todd Inlet, because there used to be a lot of eelgrass there. So that was our first eelgrass transplant in 1999 with 1,800 shoots in that beautiful little inlet that had been pretty well virtually destroyed underwater with the manufacturing of cement at the turn of the 20th century. So that's the beginning of the history, and it's not the reason that I started a nonprofit, but it was the metaphor that we used for children and adults alike to understand, as you use salmon, the passage of salmon into estuaries where eelgrass protects them and helps them to grow. So as many of you know, eelgrass can create meadows under the water that create refugia for small smolts of salmon, everything juvenile that you can think of, from crabs to sea stars to herring to whatever, has some part of their life cycle in eelgrass meadows because it protects them from predators, provides food for them, and a place to be sheltered from heavy wave energy. And this, of course, is what back in the day, when herring was plentiful, the roe would look like this on eelgrass. Now, I'm not saying that if eelgrass is not in an estuary, which oftentimes it isn't anymore, herring are up the proverbial creek for laying their roe, because they will lay their roe on anything. So eelgrass is not the only surface area, but if eelgrass is there, it's a really wonderful substrate for roe to mature on. So this is just a synopsis of what I'm saying. And for many of you, this is just a review. They're meadows, they're considered salmon highways, termed that way by conservationists in Puget Sound. They're functioning as nurseries. They provide at least 80% of food for commercially important fish species, and their refugia from predators and waves. So here's a beautiful picture of an eelgrass meadow on the west coast of Vancouver Island, near Banfield. And I just put those salmon in to show that if that eelgrass is continuous, it does create a passageway for salmon to travel through and to be protected from birds and larger predators, larger fish. And as they mature and a kelp forest is further out, then they migrate into a kelp forest. This is just to give you a sense of the biodiversity from under the mud all the way up to the waterfowl, from the zooplankton and the phytoplankton that feeds everything else. So it's very, very rich habitat. And as I say, if it's kept healthy, it does create a continuous meadow in very shallow waters on sandy and semi-sandy substrate all along the coast, but the majority of it is on the southern part of the coast, because as you travel further up north, the rockier the coast is and the harder it is for eelgrass to grow in the proper substrate. It is in pockets in areas of coast, central and northern coast, of course, but a large majority of this is on the southern coast and on the west coast of Vancouver Island in the Salish Sea as well. This is a wonderful illustration done by my friend Cameron Murray, who lives on Gabriola. And I asked him to give us a really wonderful graphic of the continuity of habitats, both under the water and above the water and on the shore, because we're educated to think in silos. So everybody who talks about eelgrass only talks about eelgrass and doesn't really show the connectivity between the near shore and forage fish, for example, who spawn in winter months on the shore and then find eelgrass, or the salmon that come out from freshwater streams as they head towards the open ocean and rest in eelgrass and kelp. So it's all one connected system. And just because I fell in love with eelgrass as a diver doesn't mean that I've ignored kelp. In fact, when I learned to be a diver in California, kelp forests were the ideal place to dive because it slowed down the waves. And there's so much beauty in them. You can be mesmerized and forget, almost forget to breathe. So anyway, this graphic shows you the forest that provides such wildlife for the birds that might be preying on the shoreline and the eelgrass and in the furthest kelp. There's shade for spawning for the forage fish. There's woody debris to provide food for salmon and many, many other species. You can see the under the mud critters, et cetera, et cetera. I think all of you know that we're talking one system. It's always important to start with the names of eelgrass. It's called tanu in the Haida language. It has a long history with First Nations communities all up and down the coast. And of course, I'm just speaking about British Columbia, but it's just as important on the East Coast as well. So this shows you a diagram of the different parts of eelgrass and how they were used by First Nations, both for ceremony and for dolls and for cooking and gathering, so many different uses. So anytime an educator is speaking about eelgrass, it's always good to start with the history of the plant and the history of its uses by First Nations. Okay, now I'm going to get into kind of the details of the article that Gloria so kindly encouraged me to write. And the Eelgrass's teacher article was geared for grades 1 to 6. But as you can tell from what I've spoken about by looking at it as a system, about the ecology, about the biodiversity, about the complexity of this plant, it can go all the way from 7th grade all the way up through high school and beyond. I just wanted to center on grades 1 to 6, but there are, towards the end of this presentation, some implications for further study with older students. So I'm starting with beach etiquette. I'm sure most of you know this. I'm not going to read through it, but it's always good to remind students because they're still, unfortunately, kind of imprisoned by 4 walls most of the time. So when they're out in open space, they tend to go a little wild. And we must teach them before they reach the beach how to treat everything they meet with respect. Besides these rules, it would be really wonderful for them to participate in thinking about additional etiquette rules if they are so inclined. There's always the safety features I don't have to go through with you. Most of you have done field trips, I'm sure. If not with students, then with your own children or your relatives. So I do not want to presume that this is all new knowledge. So I wanted to talk a little bit about younger grade levels and how they can explore the young critters. Because as I said, eelgrass habitat is great habitat for the younger stages of all species that you would find in it for shelter, food, and refugia. And it's been my experience with young children that they identify so much with juvenile critters. So they could be looking very gently for the hiding places for these young critters and probably would feel quite delighted that they would find them and treat them respectfully, but see what a treasure trove a meadow can be. Now, of course, I'm talking about low tide periods. So we're talking about a field trip during a low tide period of 1 to 2 meters, which is in the spring. And this preliminary field trip could be the beginning of something that goes further into another field trip that could cover more curriculum subjects. So we'll go into that. But the first experience can start in the classroom, of course, with aquaria, if that aquaria or seaquaria is in the school. And if not, then maps and photographs and all that kind of can start in the classroom. And so this field trip would be about an hour and a half during low tide. So for older children, say from grade 5, 4 or 5, you could talk about what they might want to know about an eelgrass before they do the field trip. For example, something like, if young crabs use eelgrass for shelter, then we'll be finding areas of crabs that are hiding from their predators. And so they could create a data sheet where they could record maybe the type of crab they found, or the size of the crab, or the exact location. Have them do some creative thinking about what a data sheet would look like if they were going to investigate that hypothesis. So let me see if I can get rid of this so I can see what I've written. It's up here. Sorry, I'm talking to myself. Students can become familiar with eelgrass ecology during a field trip. And as again, I highly recommend Sequaria in schools because any time over many years that I have spoken to children of all ages who have a sequarium in their school or their community center, they are at university level of knowledge about marine ecology, not just about species specific information, but about marine ecology. I can't say enough about having a sequaria. And if you don't know what that is, please ask me, and Kathy and Yogi would be happy to answer that question. But it's basically a saltwater aquarium in the schools. But if they're not acquainted with them, then one can be set up on the beach, and it's not that complicated. What we used initially were plastic blow up pools. I didn't like them so much because they offered too much exposure to the sun. So we used them for a little while, and then we started using 33-gallon glass aquaria. But tubs or any kind of container that doesn't leak water, that has shelter. So it could be under a tent, or if you don't want to be fancy, then pick up um, seaweed detritus to put on in the pool so that the critters that are collected either by divers or by gentle hands and put into a pool of water will be sheltered from the sun, because of course, who knows what the temperature will be like in the spring nowadays, or even the early summer. So you can set up these stations, and what I suggest is that before you reach the the beach, you set up groups of maybe 10 um, children per group, and then you can have 3 activities on the beach. So at any one station, you only have 10 children at a time, and therefore the person who is teaching at that station and also the children will get enough time to ask questions, to do observations, and really interact with what they're learning with each other and with the species. So Kathy and I did this with great success. And the first station that we would set up, because it took the most time, were these either sequoia or the tubs or the buckets. Always making sure that they're refreshed with fresh, cold seawater. Does that make sense to you? Because putting fresh and seawater together always confuses people. But what I mean is keep the water circulating. It's salt water, but it's fresh in that it's being replenished, especially if the weather is warm. You want to make sure that these animals are comfortable. Now, what I said was if you have a dive team that can go collect critters, that is ideal, because kids are fascinated by scuba divers, by the equipment, by the experience of being underwater. Some of them are aspiring scuba divers themselves. It's all a great mystery to them. And it's wonderful. And you can find through dive shops people who are volunteer divers who would be willing to take the time to do this. If you can't find that, or you don't have the time, or you're living in an area where diving volunteers just aren't an option, then you could collect critters along the shore before the kids come. I suggest 2 different habitats. One is collecting eelgrass along the beach, so they're not rooted, they're just drift eelgrass. They've already been uprooted by predators or by the wind, and you set up a little eelgrass bed. The next tub or aquarium would be a rocky habitat. So you collect rocks that may have barnacles or algae on them and create a rocky habitat so that kids can compare what they're looking at. So this takes volunteers, and parents would be great, or high school students, or whoever you can muster. Um, Now, in this picture, you see a species list. They're really wonderfully illustrated, commonly found invertebrates that one would find along the shore. And we would put critters like the ones that are identified on these ID sheets in the pools, and then ask the students to identify them instead of somebody standing there and saying, now this is a juvenile sea cucumber, or whatever, if you have divers collecting. So much of the knowledge is shared and comes from the kids observing and doing some investigation on their own, which I think is one of the fascinating aspects of field programs. We seem to have trouble advancing. There we go. So beach detritus. So at a low tide, especially in the spring, if you have had storms, you're going to get a lot of beach debris or detritus. And it's a wonderful way to introduce habitats. So you have the second station could be looking at detritus and identifying the plants and noticing the invertebrates that are feeding on those plants. You could also start talking about carbon sequestration if climate change is a subject in your curriculum. So the second program could be about collecting these and being a detective. So you find and observe without collecting, first of all. Animals, that, for example, in the detritus itself that have hard shells or that live in communities or find kelp or plants that have knobs growing on their blades. And without collecting, find these things. So you could have a group of 10. You have a group of 10 for each of these stations. Pair up the group of 10. One group would have a group of 3. And maybe on an index card, have these written, maybe 2 or 3 of them on an index card, and then have them go and explore, and then come back and talk about the 5 different sizes of barnacles they found, or the 8 different sounds that they heard, and they have to repeat them to the group. So a little bit of theater involved in this station. It's pretty fun, especially with the younger groups who are totally into learning through their senses. So, seaweed leaves that have different textures, 4 different odors or smells, 6 different kinds of birds, 7 human activities, 9 different ways that people are using the shoreline or the waters nearby. So it's a detective game, and it's pretty fun because kids are really into exploring, and this gives them a focus while they're exploring. Another way that you can use the detective game is to play beach art. And that was something that Kathy and I really enjoyed, watching how kelp and seaweeds especially were made into different forms of art. So this was called a kelp octopus. So you just bring a tarp, you lay it down, and then you assign your group of 10 to go into pairs and take the detritus and the things that they find on the shore that are not living and make pieces of art and then interpret them to the rest of the group. If you have a plant press, which is not hard to make, we also would have the kids use the detritus, the kelps, and the seaweeds to press so that after a little time has passed in the classroom, they could then make cards or stationery or whatever else they'd like to make. Good memory of their field experience. So from the classroom to the shore to the lab. Now this is pictures taken over the years of shore programs that Kathy has done, and then on the far right, one that we did for many years called Eco Rowing. And we had an indoor informal lab where we, with grant money, bought microscopes, and the kids were able to look at copepods and other phytoplankton under the microscope, and we would be able to talk about how the food chain works from the minutest of specimens that could only be observed under a microscope to orcas. So, this one field trip could be the beginning of many different kinds of experiences, both in the classroom, possibly another field trip if you have the transportation possible, or setting up some kind of lab in the classroom according to your budget. It just, field trips are such a great way to brainstorm with other teachers, which I'll talk about in a moment, or with the students themselves, how those experiences can be extended throughout the year. So if you have divers, of course, it makes it really diverse about the kind of critters that they'd be looking at. But even if you don't have divers and you have a low tide day, the investigations just go on and on and on. And these are quotes from children themselves, mostly from our eco rowing program. And oftentimes what they would say is that they were teaching themselves, which is a real treat for them instead of lectures. So through all these kinds of experiences in the field, you're starting to talk about a stewardship ethic, which means that you've already started talking about respect and being gentle and keeping animals in their habitat and finding shelter for them when it's hot, or not taking them out of the water if there's subtidal, et cetera, et cetera. It's the beginning of a stewardship ethic. And what I found is that children, as they grow older, want to be involved in hope. And so restoration is a really wonderful way to instill that sense of hopefulness. And we were able to start restoration in 99, as I said, at the Todd Inlet, and extend the restoration throughout the Salish Sea for many, many years. And it involved children and adults. So as you explore eelgrass, you can extend the knowledge and the application of that knowledge to mapping eelgrass. And I'm not going to go into this to great extent, but I will tell you where the article is that I have been referring to, because it does talk about the methodology of how you could get kids on the shore and do either very simple mapping with cadastral maps, which are basically street maps, or using transects and quadrats. So it's all described in that article. And there's so many different ways of segueing into your curriculum subjects that you're required to cover. So I'm talking about the second field trip, for those interested, could be eelgrass mapping. And I'm just going to let you read that. I'm getting close to time out, so we'll just go through this a little quickly. So part of the investigation of doing mapping is interviewing people who may be familiar to the habitat, including First Nations. So it's a social studies by going out in the community and talking about the habitat and about where it used to be or how healthy it was and what it was culturally used for. There are maps of many types, as I just referred to. It can be very simple, or it can be more complicated and even be presented to your local government folks to increase the sense of stewardship that needs to be adopted by the whole community. So students can photograph their art displays on the tarp. They can make their plant presses available for wall murals. They can write stories about the eelgrass animals. They can use math when they're doing their mapping. There's all different kinds of segues into your curriculum requirements just using this one habitat. This is a very worded explanation of how you can go from your local habitat to the global situation of climate change. Eelgrass does sequester carbon. So you could talk about that. You could talk about eelgrass diseases and what happened on the East Coast in the 30s when wasting disease wiped out eelgrass. And that's when it became quite significant because it wiped out the clam and oyster harvest there. So there's all kinds of ramifications about studying one habitat and making it a global issue. And it's a pathway into studying biology, zoology, and ecological patterns as well. Peer teaching. We've had sessions in the past where teachers are teaching teachers, and it's Kathy and Yogi are experts at this. So taking these field experiences or the ideas for future field experiences and using a Pro D day to share those ideas and improve them or just share what happened to the kids and what kind of reactions and responses happened from that experience. The best part about learning outside, this is a quote, is how peaceful it is and the focus that it gives us. You focus on one thing. I love that you can hear everything from 100 feet away. It's where you can express yourself any kind of way. This is in Todd Inlet or Sneak with a group of kids who are doing pictures of what they're seeing. Place-based Eelgrass curriculum creates opportunities for knowledge, hands-on, feet-wet experiences, empowers young people to act with a stewardship ethic. So I want to thank Trish. I want to thank Naim, Jamie Smith for many of the photographs, all the educators that I've worked with over the years, Seaquarian Schools, Lenny Ross, of course, Gloria, Kathy, and Yogi. And these are the resources. And I want to take you to the bottom web, if you can copy that down, eelgrassconservation.org. I'm sorry, seagrassconservation.org will lead you to a page that says resources, and that's where you will find Eelgrass's teacher. Now I would like to hand it over to Gloria because she wrote two wonderful, wonderful books that can be used in schools about exploring in eelgrass meadows with Sam and Crystal. And I want to thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Gloria, you're on mute.
So are you wanting me to talk just a few minutes about the Eelgrass book?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, you have the picture there, and just as what Nikki was saying, the whole book is about the ecological importance of the eelgrass ecosystem to the West Coast, and in particular to providing food, shelter, and nurseries for a great diversity of marine critters. So you will be introduced to just a huge variety of critters that are very much dependent on the eelgrass meadow, especially because it's a nursery. And so all kinds of critters from little tiny guys up to, you know, herring, salmon, black bears, eagles, orcas, humpback whales. Like, it's just the basis of a huge food chain. So anyhow, you can purchase that book from any one of the Naim folks, and the proceeds go to support Naim. And the other thing I wanted to show you, I don't know if you can see it here, but here's Karen Gilmore did a poster of this illustration, which is in the book. And so it's like about a 13 by 20 inch poster that shows the whole eelgrass meadow. And there's a key here. She's selling them for $20, which is a real deal. And you can contact her at karengilmoreart.com. So there you go.
Amazing. Thank you.
That's our commercial.
I love it. I love it. And thank you so much, Nikki, for all of those great ideas and those great resources. Lots of information for anyone who's lucky enough to have an eelgrass bed or even a shoreline to take their students to. So we really appreciate you giving us your time tonight. I would love to open it up to questions and discussion. We do have some time left, so feel free to turn on your camera, turn on your microphone. If you have any questions for Nikki, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask them, or if you'd rather type them into the chat, we can ask them for you.
I'm going to ask a question. Maybe people could just raise their hands digitally if they have done this kind of field trip. It doesn't have to be centered on eelgrass, but these kinds of field trips on the beach. Great.
A couple hands up there. And
Okay.
Lynn, I think I saw your hand go up. You have a question.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. So my area of expertise is citizen or community science. And one of the projects that I got involved with while I was in graduate school was at Nisqually Reach Nature Center. And they had an eelgrass study through Washington Department of Natural Resources. And so we went out at the, low tides. I think it was every month or every 2 weeks.
Mm.
And we measured the eelgrass and recorded which ones had the reproductive structures and the density, basically. I think those were the three things. But the other thing, and I'm really curious about any thoughts you have about this, Nikki, because we were measuring juvenile oysters, and we had oyster cages in the eelgrass and oyster cages outside of the eelgrass to see if there was a difference in the growth rate of the oysters in versus oysters out. And it looked like, at least from the preliminary data that we were collecting, that the oysters looked more healthy and grew better in the eelgrass. Okay, so now here's the conundrum. So I've done some research papers on shellfish and, the use of pesticides to get rid of the mud shrimp, that churn, bioturbulate, all that. And it's my understanding that the shellfish growers, and of course this is in Washington State, can't grow oysters in the eelgrass beds. And I don't know if it's because the eelgrass beds are so important. But then after, having been involved as a volunteer and seeing the oysters growing more robustly in eelgrass beds, I'm wondering, is there some way that could, work? I don't know if you all are doing that in British Columbia already. Anyway, my brain is about ready to explode because I have so many questions, but I thought I would start with, do you have any information about any research showing how the seafood, that we want to harvest growing, better in eelgrass? I know there's some issues with like harvesting in eelgrass because then the eelgrass kind of gets in the way. Okay, I'll stop there because I could just go on. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great subject. The first thing that occurred to me is that eelgrass, because it's clonal, and if they're given the right conditions of a very soft substrate, of a sandy, slightly stony, but sandy would be best substrate, and it grows by an underground stem called a rhizome. And it's clonal for the most part. It grows vegetatively most successfully, also grows according to seed, but not as fast or as productively. So when it has that mat of rhizomes right underneath the surface of the substrate, it brings down the suspended sediment that's in the water column. So both the oyster that's filtering the water and the eelgrass through its rhizomes and through its biomass that's calming wave action, they are really beneficial for each other. It's a very symbiotic, wonderful relationship. So I'm not surprised that the oysters are growing well because they're not having to spend so much energy filtering the water as they are into putting their growth, putting energy into their growth. It's not as stressful. The other thing is eelgrass has been shown recently to take some of the pollutants out of the water as well. I would think that in our neck of the woods, shellfish has become quite a mega industry, especially on some of the Gulf Islands, Denman in particular. And so I'm not talking about mom and pop businesses anymore. When you get into an industrial scale industry, they don't give a flying hoot about what they're interfering with. It's about product, getting the product to market and making a profit. So you've changed the name of the game. If you're a mom and pop, small industry, you could consider possibly harvesting those oysters from the bed, but not on an industrial size. You would be wrecking the bed. It's federally protected in Washington, as it is in BC. It would be against the law to tear up the eelgrass bed to get your healthier oyster, because the eelgrass had been there, right? Until you ruined it. So that's my short answer. I find what you said was fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much. That does, yeah, no, I completely understand what you're saying. And, you know, from all the research I've done, the thing that really hits me is we're laying oysters flat to harvest them. Whereas if they grow naturally, they're in beds that are
Yes,
vertical. And
that's
this
right.
is part of the problem.
That's part of the problem. That's
I'm
right.
not going to say anymore, but I see
Okay.
another
That's
answer.
right.
Cool.
Good
Thank you very
question.
much. I see Kathy and Yogi, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I could comment on that question, specifically with native oysters, so not the Pacific oysters that are being grown commercially. So we're looking at the gorge, where there's tons of eelgrass as well as tons of native oysters, and they don't overlap. So there's either an oyster bed or an eelgrass bed. Now, no, so we moved one of those oyster beds, up above the eelgrass, and they immediately got smothered by all the sediment in the water. And that sediment attracted the eelgrass, so the eelgrass grew up around our oyster bed and drew the sediment out of the water. And so then the oyster bed got cleaned off again by the water current, and the oysters are doing fine. So I think it's not necessarily, that they need to be together, but they could be, very adjacent to one another in a very productive fashion. Now, of course, the native oyster, especially in Washington, where, you sort of seed them onto tiny little things in the mud, which is not really a natural habitat for those Pacific oysters anyways. You're starting to talk about different things, especially once you start putting pesticides on to get rid of the shrimp. So like Nikki says, it's not really a natural game anymore. But I'm not sure that they would really be beneficial actually growing together in that fashion. And I'm interested to hear that they seem to be healthier that way.
Cool. Thank you for adding that. Any other questions, comments, discussion? Gloria?
This is a question. As we all know, the European green crab, is an invasive species that, has come north from San Francisco, having been introduced in the ballast water of shipping ships across the ocean. They're certainly in the Souk Basin, like they're all over the place. And I've read that they actually dig up the roots of eelgrass. Is that true?
Yeah, they're going after other prey. So eelgrass is not their main target, but they disturb the eelgrass beds. Coastal Restoration Society is doing an excellent job, but they just lost their funding. They were collecting 10,000 a day.
Oh my God. Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wasting disease also is always present in eelgrass, but with changing sea temperatures, it could become prevalent. And that's a kind of mold that wiped out the eelgrass on the east coast of the United States in the 30s. So we have to kind of watch out for that. So European green crab is a big threat.
Yeah. Yeah. I might just
Thank you.
mention, this might sound a little bit weird, but I don't know. I'm just trying to think of how long ago this was. 50, 55 years ago when I was teaching, fairly early in on my teaching. I set up a saltwater aquarium in the classroom. And what I did is I had a refrigerator, like an old refrigerator, drilled holes through the outside of the refrigerator, and then holes into the freezer compartment of the refrigerator, and then pumped, like I had like 50 feet of plastic tubing, and pumped seawater from the aquarium through the freezer compartment and back into the refrigerator.
Mhm.
And that actually worked quite well for about a month. And the advantage of that was that, you know, because the aquarium was in the classroom, the kids could keep a daily diary, you know, observations. They would take turns sitting there, you know, for a long time, and they kept a diary of what happened in the aquarium. And I think that's probably pretty similar to what Kathy and Yogi were doing with their sea aquaria, because I know you were setting up aquariums in schools, in libraries and such. But anyhow, that's how we did it years ago. And I had a friend who had a Coca-Cola machine, and she drilled holes through the Coca-Cola machine. And actually, it worked quite well.
Innovation. Any other questions for Nikki?
Yeah, I have another one, but
Okay.
just to comment, Gloria, I saw one of those Coke machines
Oh,
retrofitted on used Victoria the other day.
you're kidding.
So,
Really? And it wasn't used for that?
yep.
For an aquarium?
Yeah.
Wow, I thought that was something that probably went out a long time ago and would probably get in trouble for doing.
No, they
But
seem to keep coming up.
it worked so well, you know, that I could I made a big deal out of taking the critters back, you know, to the ocean afterwards. And yeah.
So Nikki, you know, you were involved a bit in a discussion on the goose predation on eelgrass. And so, I mean, some people feel quite strongly about it and feel we should shoot another reason to turn the goose into sausage. But I was wondering, I mean, I've also read that to some extent it's beneficial in the sense that it sort of forces the eelgrass to go into reproductive mode, you know, by seeds, in addition to, you know, just the vegetative, or, you know, it's in a sense, it's a renovation process for the eelgrass. I was wondering how you feel about that.
So when you just said that, a little unknown secret is that First Nations, especially in the Salish Sea, would harvest eelgrass and would, in fact, while they're doing that, would do the exact same thing that you just described. They were encouraging the grass to grow and it would fill in very quickly. But I don't talk about that amongst groups because for obvious reasons, we don't seem to have a sense of balance about that. But it was a custom to have a fork that would go right into the substrate and you twist and you bring out the eelgrass, and it was common practice with some of the nations. I'm not so concerned, to tell you the truth. When I've watched geese get into eelgrass, of course I'm upset. It's very aggressive. And they eat the whole plant, and you know, like they go for the whole banana. But if the eelgrass is healthy and growing in a healthy place, yes, it will recover quickly. Where I am concerned about geese is the predation upon dune grasses in salt marshes. That's where the harm is done. And it's a huge, huge issue in Campbell River and Comox. And they're doing goose fencing and everything else. And I totally empathize with them because the disaster that happens on salt marshes and wetlands from geese predation, I think, in my opinion, it's not scientifically found, is much more severe than geese and eelgrass. So thank you for bringing that up. You know, geese are the culprit because we brought them into the province artificially, and it's our fault that they're here. They're not migratory. So, you know, the ones that are doing the most harm are the ones that are here all year round, and it's our fault. So this is what happens when we bring in, you know, something for our own purposes. For that, I think it was hunting, but Sometimes we do bizarre things because we think we're fixing things and we're not. We're making them worse.
So I have a question about, you're talking about the geese. What about the black brants, geese that that I know as they fly north to their nesting grounds, they land at eelgrass estuaries all along the way.
Yes.
So I would assume they're not destroying the eelgrass.
Even if they are, as I say, if the eelgrass is in healthy substrate and in good conditions, it does recover. And the neat thing about that, until climate change really became known, was that the brant were timing it, or in the herring were timing it, so that the brant were arriving when the roe was on the eelgrass. So added protein, added calories, everything was in balance. And now climate change has really screwed that up, as well as recreational use of beaches with dogs going amok. I live close to Island View Beach, which is a beautiful, beautiful place with quite a lot of eelgrass offshore. And the branch showed up temporarily and now gone. And usually I count at least 100 before they go to Parksville, which is the major mecca. So I'm worried about the dogs and ignorance of the dog owners, as well as the climate change factor. I don't know how the geese are doing in Parksville, but I'm concerned about it locally. So I'm making some judgments about how they're doing generally in BC as they're on their migratory route.
This year, brant geese were there at Island View Beach.
Yeah, they are every year, but they
Yeah.
showed up briefly and only a few. Sometimes they're scouts. This was in early February. And by March, you found 50 to 100, and they're not showing up. But there are a lot of dogs out there.
Mhm.
And
So-
just the interruption of,
A lot of interruptions, which give, they just say, well, can't do it here.
they stop feeding completely as soon as.
Yeah, they
it's
just say,
talking
this
about
isn't
it.
going to
Yeah.
work because too much energy is expended just to get out of the way of the dogs.
So you would expect more luscious eelgrass beds where there's many, many dogs.
Oh, that's a very good point. Too many other factors. But you know what's,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm just gonna gossip for a minute. The river otters are chasing the dogs at that site. So maybe the river otters will bring the brat back.
What about the impact of the bird flu right now also?
Yeah, that's a
That
good
could
point.
Have an impact on the number of birds, because I noticed that they were talking about it even on the East Coast, the impact of seabirds and shorebirds
Very good
by
point.
bird flu. So that
Yeah.
could be well this
That
time.
could be one of the factors. That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, I like the idea of your hands-on activities. I've always done hands-on activities, but we have high school interns that we have on the beach as tide pool ambassadors.
Oh my.
we
Where are you
also-
talking from?
We're in Oregon,
Oh,
so
great.
hopefully you get to come to our conference this year
Yeah.
in July. We're still working on getting the call for presenters page organized. It's like one little thing we're still waiting for, but anyway, and then we'll get it up. But we have so I'm with Friends of Otter Rock Marine Reserve, and we have high schoolers that we hire during the summer to be our tide pool ambassadors, and down there, but they also have the ability or opportunity to table, like at the Marine Science Center for Marine Science Center days of the Oregon Coast Aquarium. And so I like to have different types of hands-on activities for them there. So I screenshot your little list of activities that they
Great.
have there as well. So
Wonderful. Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
so
That's
I wanted to
wonderful.
thank you for that.
Super.
All right. Well, I got to get off, but thank you guys. That was amazing, Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
I
Wonderful
wonder,
talk. Nikki.
wonder if I could ask another question.
Yes,
at this
Yogi.
time. And it's, it kind of touches on what Fawn was saying. I mean, Nikki, you do education, but you do all kinds of wonderful other things. And they're all tied to one another in terms, we can say broadly under conservation, right? And I was wondering, to what extent do you see, the education showing up in terms of improved conservation, or how do we measure that?
Oh, really good question. So to be clear, I'm no longer the executive director of SeaChange. I'm not totally involved, like I used to be. I just wanted to say that working at the Pacific Salmon Foundation, what we're doing is creating guidebooks for people who want to do restoration and mapping and monitoring, so that this information, it's not rocket science, can be put out there and people can do much of this work on their own with guidance. So that's what I'm doing now, and much less education, et cetera. So how is education making an impact is what you're asking. And I'm kind of out of the slipstream. I did do a very short program just the other day with Claremont and found them fascinating. They were 12th grade biology students. And many of them, according to the teacher, are very interested in environmental field for careers. And when I asked them a few questions, I was astounded with the answers. A lot of ecological systems being portrayed, that they're thinking in systems rather than species specific ways, which I think is a great breakthrough from the way we're educated, right? I find being with young people right now, whether they're graduate students, university students, high school students, they're telling me what is going on as far as a regime change, is what I call it. We have been stuck in a certain kind of way of looking at the world that is, so, as I said before, siloed. And so when we're talking about education, I think there's a regime change going on about connecting the dots and looking at things much more holistically. And I see that reflected in the comments from high school students all the way up to the graduate students. The other thing I'm seeing in the conference I went to on kelp is collaboration. People are talking about cooperation and collaboration rather than competition. And to me, that's about this regime change that I'm very excited about, is finally the big egos are starting to leave, and students are now thinking the only way we can know about this subject, whether it's kelp, eelgrass, salt marshes, whatever, is to combine our forces and talk with each other and stop competing. And so I was just joyful after this kelp conference I went to a couple of weeks ago in Victoria, because I saw this in action. And I had been going for 25, 30 years, as you have, Yogi and Kathy, to these conferences where all you hear is top-down kind of thinking in so many ways. And I think it's changing. So I think education is changing as well. And these high school students are telling me that. So I'm very hopeful, and I only become hopeful when I'm still involved. So I'm talking to the older folks in the audience. Stay involved in every way you can, because otherwise you think things are true when they actually are not anymore. There are changes going afoot that are very, very exciting. And that's my soapbox talk for the night.
Love it. Love it.
So
Yeah.
much for retiring.
Yeah. Yeah. Why retire when we can be a part of it? I mean, the same
And
for Utah guys too, right?
yeah. And I think that's a great place to sign off tonight in the interest of time. I think that that's a great parting message for us all. So we thank you, Nikki, for being here. We thank everyone for giving us your evening and your participation. And we hope to see you in April when we talk about 20,000 sensors under the sea.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you.